China defends multilateralism and urges a negotiated end to the Ukraine conflict at the United Nations General Assembly. Hello, I'm Anton Fedyashin, and this is The Heat. Chinese Vice President Han Zheng delivered a speech this Thursday during the United Nations General Assembly. He stressed China's position that the Ukraine conflict should have a diplomatic solution and that the world needs to work together towards development. For more, let's go straight now to UN headquarters in New York and talk to CGTN's Nathan King. Nathan, what can you tell us about the Chinese Vice President's speech?
It was concise, 13 minutes. You're out 15 and most go over, but he really rattled off the points and very much supporting the theme of this summit, of course, which is the Sustainable Development Goals at their halfway point. And as you know, the Global Development Initiative that was launched by President Xi Jinping in his address to the UN 2 years ago has sort of helped countries share best practices to try and deliver those goals. Also talking about the way in which the BRI has helped with development. It's 10 years, of course, of the Belt and Road Initiative. There's going to be the third summit of that coming up in Beijing, and very much underscoring that the 20th Party Congress, the whole idea of China's national rejuvenation, living in harmony with nature, prosperity for all, very much fits into that development agenda and says no matter how much China develops, it will not seek any hegemony or territorial expansion. Now, on the issue of Ukraine, you know, there's been a lot of words bandied about here, but he was very much saying that China is willing to use its good offices to try and help bring about a solution. Let's take a listen.
We should address the legitimate security concerns of all countries and resolve differences and disputes in a peaceful way through dialogue and consultation. Cessation of hostilities and resumption of peace talk is the only way to settle the Ukraine crisis. China supports all efforts that are conducive to the peaceful resolution of the Ukraine crisis and stands ready to continue playing a constructive role for the early attainment of peace.
Also, talking about nuclear weapons, as we know that's come up occasionally in reference to the Ukraine conflict. He says that China says that nuclear weapons should never be used, that there should never be a nuclear war, and that China is the only country among the permanent 5 members who has a no first use policy when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons. One other thing I want to mention is that when it comes to sovereignty, very much drawing the red line over Taiwan, saying that Taiwan is part of China, has been since ancient times, and telling other countries not to get involved, essentially a domestic issue, also saying that human rights are a decision for each different society and should not be weaponized against other countries.
Nathan, just one more point on the Ukraine conflict. The Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, he also addressed the General Assembly. How was his speech received?
Yeah, and he also addressed the Security Council as well, which was fiery. Listen, there was a feeling here last year that the Ukraine conflict, no matter how much sympathy there is for Kiev or Moscow, that the Ukraine conflict was overshadowing the real job of the United Nations. You know, development, the global south, other problems, for example, Haiti, now we have Sudan, Yemen, etc. And his speech was sort of couched in much more terms about, look, this war, even though it's far away in Europe for the global south, affects you. You saw your grain prices go up. You saw your fuel prices spike. What happens in our country affects your country. And also trying to push the case in international law. If the UN doesn't care about this threat to international peace and security in Europe, well, it might not care when it happens to you. But I mean, a lot of, for example, countries in the African continent, Latin American continent, Asia have said, look, you know, the UN hasn't been able to intervene with us. So that's how it was received. But there is a growing weariness with the world's attention and the split in the Security Council, which essentially can't do much else because of the split over Ukraine. This is not a United Nations problem, and I'm speaking from a global South perspective, nations here, but essentially a Western versus Russia problem. You see what I'm saying?
That's right, Nathan. Thank you very much. That's CGTN's Nathan King in New York. Well, there's a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panel. From New York, Aaron Maté is the host of Pushback with Aaron Maté on the Grayzone. Yves Engler is a political activist and author. He joins us from Montreal in Canada. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a history professor at American University, and Einar Tangen, joining us from Beijing, is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. Welcome to all of you. Einar Tangen, we just heard the address from the Chinese Vice President Han Zheng. His speech, in which he called for a negotiated settlement to the Ukraine conflict. He also said that China continues to support the aspirations of the Palestinian people. His speech seemed something of a stark contrast to the one made by President Biden earlier. And, you know, President Biden barely addressed the situation in the Middle East between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And now he's calling for more money, which in effect would prolong this war in Ukraine. There's been absolutely no talk from the Americans on some kind of a diplomatic end to this war. I mean, this war. What do you make of this contrast between the two? Hi, Einar, can you hear me? I think your mic's muted.
This is very balkanized. Unfortunately, what you have here is Biden is doubling down on this, Putin shall not win idea that was echoed by the president of Ukraine, Zelensky. Unfortunately, it's not really going anywhere. The whole idea of a peace club was walked back by Lula and in Brazil after meeting with Zelensky. Unfortunately, it looks like the UN is becoming more of a talk shop. There was a lot of people who were not there symbolically, Modi, Putin, Xi, Macron, Sunak, and there was as much news outside the UN as inside, as you had, global catastrophes, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, it's just Biden seemed out of sync with the realities that were going on out there, whereas China was, in essence, repeating many of the themes that it has said before.
Yves Engler, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he also addressed the General Assembly. He normally does that right at the beginning, and he lamented the fact that the UN right now seems incapable of resolving the kind of growing tensions that we're seeing around the world. Let's listen to part of what Mr. Guterres said.
Our world is becoming unhinged. Geopolitical tensions are rising. Global challenges are mounting. And we seem incapable of coming together to respond.
So, Yves, has it always been like this, or is there a feeling right now that the UN seems to be paralyzed? It can't act?
Yeah, I think there's some sense of it can't act, but that works in some weird ways, right? For instance, on Haiti, your person on the ground talked about Haiti, and they haven't been able to act on Haiti, and lots of Haitians think that's a good thing, right? The U.S. and Canada have been trying to push a UN intervention force into Haiti, and Russia and China have about a week ago they refused to have the meeting on Haiti that the U.S. is trying to push forward that mission. Now on development questions, the Ukraine war is taking up too much attention, and the NATO countries are pushing more and more discussion about Ukraine, and more focus on sending more weapons and trying to isolate Russia. And in that case, that's taking away from the incredible inequities in the world and the growing climate crisis. So, there being divisions within the UN is not necessarily a bad thing, or at least within the Security Council, because there's a long history of the Security Council just going along with what mostly with what Washington wants. And so Russia and China not doing that is, I think, often a good thing for the world. But on these other questions around the climate crisis and around global inequity, the UN does need to be a much more dynamic institution.
Right, and Yves, of course, the United Nations was formed in the aftermath of World War II with very noble intentions, you know, to prevent war, to promote development, to work together to resolve some of the world's biggest challenges. I mean, what is it going to take for the UN to get back to its roots, to be able to work together and find solutions to the myriad issues, some of them which you've just mentioned, that face the world right now?
Well, I think first and foremost is that the wealthiest and the most militaristic countries, specifically beginning with the US, need to stop being so military-minded and so imperialistic-minded, and have to say that they actually believe in a more equal world, right? I mean, to go at a macro level, should there be 5 countries, including countries that have, you know, now are probably 30th largest population country like Britain, should they have a veto on the Security Council, right? So the whole structure needs to be, I think, rethought. There are other countries like India that probably should be on the Security Council. The veto should be questioned, and the kind of structure about using the UN and building up economic parts of the UN initiatives around economic redistribution need to be strengthened. And not, you know, I should say also one of the things Biden was pushing is sort of a reinvigoration of the International Monetary Fund, and that's really about sort of pushing or challenging or responding to China's Belt and Road Initiative. But that's just more of sort of these geopolitical games that you know, just reinforce the sort of, you know, divisions within the world and reinforce this idea that we aren't a collective humanity.
Anton Fedyashin, would it be fair to say that the United Nations is losing much of its effectiveness because of the preponderance of regional blocs that are forming? You know, there doesn't seem to be a few months going by without some new acronym popping up where, you know, regional blocs, countries feel that they can be more effective if they are with like-minded fellows.
Anand, I think that both of the factors that you mentioned are an outgrowth of the general dysfunction of the current geopolitical situation in the world. Regional organizations within the past 20 years, and especially since the Ukraine crisis began in 2014, have started gathering popularity and expanding prodigiously, by the way, if you look at the BRICS, for example, precisely because the West has been trying to desperately maintain its old status as the arbiter of the world's destinies, which it's certainly enjoyed for several centuries now, going all the way back to the post-Columbian period. And so the dysfunction that has caused, the problems, the conflicts on the rifts of these tectonic shifts that we're witnessing right now is exactly what is empowering regional organizations, which no longer trust in Western-led institutions. And unfortunately, the UN is becoming less functional and less able to actually deal with problems in a practical way, precisely for the same reason. So they're both effects of the same cause.
Right, but one thing the United Nations does have, Anton, is that, especially the Security Council in the United Nations, it does have legal clout. Those decisions that are made, they are legally binding. And to a large extent, regional organizations don't have that.
Yes, absolutely. Now, here we run into the problem of the political will to actually implement these decisions. Look, within the past, 15 years, we've had two examples of Security Council decisions that should have been abided by, but weren't. For one of them is the intervention in Libya in 2011, which was legalized by the Security Council in order to protect civilians, but then was hijacked and turned into yet another regime change operation with predictably disastrous consequences. The other example, much closer to what we've been talking about on this show, and for the past 18 months, has been the UN Security Council's unanimous endorsement of the Minsk II agreement to reintegrate the Donbass into the rest of Ukraine peacefully, but with conditions. The Security Council endorsement, of course, gave it the status of international law. That's the whole process. That's the point. And it was simply not implemented. And as we found out later from multiple actors who were involved, three of them having signed the agreement, they never intended to implement it to begin with. So again, we come back to the issue of political will, and there's simply not enough of it to settle international disputes. That's why countries are taking it to regional organizations.
Right. Aaron Maté, of course, Ukraine preoccupied many of the delegates at the UN General Assembly. It dominated discussions as well. The Ukrainian President Zelensky, he addressed the General Assembly, and he also addressed the Security Council. He's been in Washington. He's been holding discussions with members of the US Congress. He's also been holding discussions just a few hours ago with the White House, including President Biden. President Biden has pledged more help for Ukraine, more weapons, another $325 million worth in a military package. But polls tell us that public support for Ukraine is dropping. More than half of Americans polled saying enough is enough. Where is this heading?
And that majority opposition in the U.S. to continuing to fund the Ukraine proxy war is particularly striking because most of the population is being denied the basic facts by their media. So, for example, no establishment U.S. media outlet has reported the now pretty widely accepted fact that there was a tentative peace deal reached in April 2022, the first weeks of Russia's invasion. A peace deal reached between Ukraine and Russia that could have ended this war. Instead, Boris Johnson, then the Prime Minister of the UK, came over, presumably at the behest of the US, and told Zelensky, if you sign this deal with Putin, we're not going to back you up. That basically was an order to keep fighting. So amazingly, most Americans don't know about that, but still, in the majority, are against it. And that's because they don't see funneling tens of billions of dollars into a prolonged proxy war is in their interest. There are much more pressing needs at home. In terms of where this is heading, it's hard to predict, but the reality on the ground, all the reports out of Ukraine are not very encouraging for Ukraine's much-hyped counteroffensive. There are all these Pollyannish predictions about Ukraine was going to punch through Russian lines. That hasn't happened. And now Ukraine is hoping for the delivery of these long-range ATACMS missiles from Biden. There was some indication that Biden was going to do that, but this week Biden pulled back and said that that decision is not happening yet. So all this really is up to the U.S. Will they funnel even more heavy weaponry into this war, or will they finally allow the diplomacy that they've blocked up until this point?
Aaron, do you think that this conflict in Ukraine will feature significantly in the run-up to the 2024 presidential election? I mean, we're now seeing opposition to this conflict even among politicians. There's a very senior senator in the Republican Party, Rand Paul, who's posing some questions now about how this conflict will end, and can the United States continue to supply these vast amounts of money and weapons to Ukraine? I mean, do you think this conflict will get some kind of traction with voters?
Well, I think it should. I mean, it's striking that you have this proxy war declared with no debate. Nobody voted in Congress for a proxy war with the world's other top nuclear power. Initially, both parties, with the exception of some people on the Republican side at the fringe, were in lockstep. All the progressives, Bernie Sanders, the Squad, the entire Congressional Progressive Caucus. Even when the Congressional Progressive Caucus came out about a year ago in favor of diplomacy, they retracted that call within 24 hours after getting yelled at by the bipartisan establishment. So far, with the exception of some people on the Republican side, it's been near complete uniformity. In any healthy democracy, there would at least be a debate over this. And we'll see. You know, Donald Trump has said some things about being for peace, but then if you look at his record in office, he did a lot to actually bring this war to fruition.
Yeah.
So in a healthy democracy, yes, there should be a debate, but we don't exactly live in that, so we'll see.
Anton, very quickly, one other significant development. Poland has now said that it will not be supplying weapons to Ukraine. This was one of Ukraine's closest allies when this conflict began. And Poland, of course, is also used as a major conduit for weapons from other NATO countries to go through to Ukraine. How significant is this?
Well, it's a very big deal for the Ukrainians because Poland has been one of the most vocal supporters, along with Baltic states, Poland's own neighbors. I'm not sure to what degree we should take this seriously. Let's give it several days and weeks and see if the Polish government reverses its decision. There's an election coming up. A lot of polls are asking the predictable questions, the same ones that that you and Aaron were just talking about the cost of the war. What is the overall objective?
Right.
What's the blowback at home? And so the Polish government is definitely becoming worried about losing control. But if it wins, I would not be surprised if it reverses that decision. But it imposes very harsh conditions on the Ukrainians.
Einar Tangen, President Biden in his address talked about China. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
I've said we are for de-risking, not decoupling with China. We will push back on aggression and intimidation and defend the rules of the road, from freedom of navigation to overflight to level economic playing field that have helped safeguard security and prosperity for decades. But we also stand ready to work together with China on issues where progress hinges on our common efforts.
So, Einar, there we have President Biden there accusing China of aggression and intimidation. On the other hand, we have a string of senior Biden administration officials who've been making their way to Beijing for talks with Chinese officials, among them Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, the Commerce Secretary has been there, Secretary of State Blinken has been there. In fact, he held a meeting with the senior Chinese official Wang Yi in Malta earlier this week. There's also been a meeting between Blinken and the Vice President Han Zheng on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. So all these meetings taking place, yet we also hear, I should say, aggressive noises out of the White House. I mean, is there any consistency that you see to American policy towards China?
Well, I mean, if you look at it from Washington's point of view, they're trying to, as they put it, set the rules of the road. In essence, they want China to acquiesce to being held down economically while they ring around it militarily. Obviously, Beijing is not going to go along with that. So, you know, once again, you have these conflicting messages coming out of the UN when the reality is slightly different. But, you know, it's always one step forward, two steps back. At the same time as you're having these meetings, you know, the U.S. Congress is, you know, saying that China is evil. You have congressmen demanding that anybody who has a passport from China has to be identified if they work for or with the U.S. government as potential security threats. It just doesn't seem to end. But, you know, more importantly, you know, you look at these series of speeches and how they're kind of reiterating, in essence, existing positions versus the dynamism of the BRICS Plus, where you had countries wanting to join. And I think the contrast there shows you that the UN is in danger of falling behind.
Yves Engler, there was a piece in Foreign Policy magazine which was headlined, "America can't stop China's rise, and it should stop trying." The article points to the fact that China has the means to retaliate in ways which could seriously hurt America. And it also points out that sanctions against China have not worked. Whenever the United States has denied China some product or some service, China has developed its own. I mean, these two countries' economies are so intertwined. So when we hear President Biden and other American leaders talk about decoupling or de-risking, call it what you will, I mean, is that just talk?
Well, I don't think it's just talk. I mean, I think there have been some sanctions that are, you know, real sanctions. The Americans, obviously, by pushing different sanctions on China, they are also hurting themselves. But I think that that the U.S. policy is serious. The sanctions on semiconductors, the different efforts to sabotage China's economic rise, is a pretty major objective of the U.S. Ruling class. There are, of course, divisions within that. There are big sectors of American capital that are making lots of money in China and want to keep making money and want to keep trading, and are worried that they're going to be left behind in the global order. But I think that these are serious efforts that should be resisted. I should also say that China's economic rise is a good thing. I mean, this is biggest country in the world, or tied for the biggest country in the world, and there's no reason why the U.S. and Canada and the European countries should be the dominant economic forces in the world.
Aaron, getting back to the General Assembly, we just heard earlier in the show, Einar Tangen was telling us that many of the world's leaders are not in New York at the United Nations General Assembly. The chief White House correspondent for the U.S. national television network NBC, his name is Peter Alexander. He had this to say about the fact that not many world leaders are at this year's General Assembly. Let's listen.
This president has a unique opportunity on this UN that's unlike others in the past, which is the leaders of Russia, China, France, and the UK are all absent this year, which, in the words of the advisors, allows President Biden, if he handles the moment appropriately, to be the president of the world, to really make this case on behalf of the world.
So do you buy that, Aaron, that this gives President Biden the opportunity to be, in the words of that correspondent, the president of the world?
That's a wonderful window into the mentality of establishment reporters in the U.S., that they would want to promote the notion that the U.S. is the president of the world. And that's how they see the world. That's how they genuinely look at the planet. They believe in U.S. hegemony. They believe in U.S. exceptionalism. And that's what they promote. That's what shapes their coverage. I think the rest of the world sees that as a joke. And they see that especially as a joke under Joe Biden, who has overseen this disastrous proxy war, sacrificed Ukraine, pretended to be Ukraine's ally while basically blocking every reasonable opportunity to end the war, unable to provide the basics for his own population. I mean, millions of people in the U.S. lack health care, and yet Biden could consider the notion that he's somehow the president of the world when he can't even provide for the basics of his people at home. So, I mean, that's a joke, but that's to be expected from corporate media stenographers. One absence that I found particularly striking was the absence of President Assad of Syria and Xi Jinping of China, who are now meeting together in China. This is Assad's first foreign trip, or at least first trip to China in many years. And Syria is hoping for Chinese help to help rebuild after a catastrophic dirty war that the so-called president of the world, the U.S., oversaw, that destroyed the country. And when I was in Syria a few years ago, I know many people there were hopeful that China could help them. And that's just the fact that they're not there at the UN General Assembly speaks to how the world is changing, and the so-called president of the world is being left behind.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.